I still get voicemails from my mother that start with, "Hey, baby," like we aren't two adults who know exactly what the other one wants. The one last week was about a refrigerator, urgent, because theirs finally died, and they just need a little help until payday. I listened to it in my grandparents' kitchen, at the scarred oak table where Grandpa taught me to play chess and Grandma wrote our grocery list in tidy cursive. The sun was spilling across the yellowed linoleum, catching the dust in the air like glitter. It would have been a pretty morning if not for her voice in my ear, all sugar on the surface and the old ledger book underneath. It's funny how money turns love into math. How a number can sit there with a dollar sign, cold and exact, and somehow tally years of absence, forgetfulness, performative hugs in front of relatives, and the heavy quiet of a boy learning early not to expect anything on his birthday. My earliest real memory is a birthday, actually. 7 candles that nobody lit. I woke up curled around the promise of a cake I'd seen in a supermarket flyer. Chocolate, thick frosting, those little sugar balloons. My mother had circled it with a highlighter. "We'll get it Saturday," she'd said. "Don't let me forget." Saturday came and went with laundry and a quick stop at my dad's friend's garage, and then a fight that shook the kitchen walls while I tried to build a fort out of couch cushions. They forgot. On Sunday afternoon my dad said, "We'll do something next weekend," and my mother turned to me, bright and brittle, and said, "Smile if Nana calls, okay? She thinks we're doing a party." That night she took a picture of me with a single cupcake under the yellow microwave light. She warned me, "Look happy." So I did, and she sent it to the family group text. When my grandmother called later and I said, "It was good," she paused for a second too long. That was the first time I ever heard doubt in her voice. My parents were professionals at the family show. At Thanksgiving they'd hold hands and crack jokes in chorus. My mother would compliment my grades like she'd read them, "All is again," and my dad would ruffle my hair with a pride I recognized from hours he spent staring at himself in the bathroom mirror. If anyone had asked me what we were like when the dishes were put away, I would have said we were like the house when the heater kicked off in January. Silent for a minute, then a long, hollow settling, the kind of quiet that makes you feel smaller. Grandma and Grandpa lived across town in the big old house with the wraparound porch and the creak in the third stair that always told on you after bedtime. When they found out about the forgotten birthday, my grandmother had a way of asking questions that caught what you didn't say. They started picking me up on weekends. "Bring your backpack," Grandma would say, like it was her idea to make sure I had enough toothpaste, enough socks. My grandfather, who grew up poor and stubborn, never asked permission. He'd honk the Buick twice, and when I came out with my shoes untied because my mother was doing her nails, he'd bend down and tie them, and the knot would hold all weekend. It got worse with time. There were other birthdays, other candles that stayed unlit. There was the talent show where I played a piano piece I practiced until my knuckles ached. My parents promised to be there, and my mother texted 10 minutes before saying the dog had thrown up. We didn't have a dog. My grandfather sat in the front row and stood up first when I finished. He has the kind of clap you can feel in your chest. Every kid on the stage looked at him and smiled. That night, he didn't say a word about my parents. He only showed me how to polish the old wooden keys on his porch organ, how to make them shine. The summer I turned 14, my parents forgot me at the community pool. It started to drizzle and the lifeguard told me I had to leave. I stood under the awning with my towel and my phone with 3% battery, watching my mom's name ring and ring. The sky cracked open and the rain slapped the concrete in huge, wet coins. Grandpa's Buick pulled up like a storm itself, wipers thrashing. He didn't say anything when I slid into the passenger seat, just reached behind me for an old beach towel and threw it over my shoulders. When we got back to their house, Grandma met me at the door with a mug of cocoa that smelled like cinnamon. She kissed my wet hair and said, "You don't have to go back tonight if you don't want to." I didn't. I never fully moved home again. No one made a scene. There was no custody battle. My parents liked telling people they were letting me spread my wings. I still saw them on holidays when relatives were around, when a camera was somewhere, but I slept in the blue room at the top of the stairs in my grandparents' house, the one with the built-in shelves that sagged under the weight of paperbacks. Grandpa taught me about compound interest and how to fix a leaking faucet. Grandma taught me to cook eggs 3 different ways and to write thank you notes that don't sound like an apology. They noticed the quiet things. When I kept my school awards in a drawer because I didn't want to make my mother mad, Grandma framed them and put them up next to the black and white photographs of relatives I'd never met. When I got my first B, Grandpa said, "Good. Now you know the grade doesn't matter as much as the work." When I admitted, voice shaking, that I felt loyal and disloyal in the same breath, wanting my parents and also hoping they stayed away, Grandma squeezed my knee and said, "Sometimes love is a garden and sometimes it's a boundary fence. Both of them are tools to keep life growing." I don't know when they decided the house would be mine one day. Maybe it was the day I followed Grandpa down to the basement and he opened a dusty metal lockbox, pulling out typed pages with neat signatures and a blue seal. "Trust," he told me, "isn't only for money. It's also the choice you make to believe someone will keep their promise." He explained what a trust was with patience. A container. He said mine would hold the house and some savings to keep the roof from leaking and to help me with school. "So you can study in peace," he said. "So you won't ever feel beholden to anyone who uses love like a favor." Their plan was a long, steady thread through my teenage years. I graduated. They sat side by side in the bleachers, waving like kids when I found them. My parents showed up 15 minutes late with Starbucks and sunglasses, hugged me tight when a camera pointed our way, and slipped out early to beat traffic. The next day my grandmother drove with me to the university and cried in the Target parking lot because we were putting aisle 9 into a dorm room. Grandpa labeled my boxes with a Sharpie and a system, wrote books in big letters on the heaviest ones, so I'd ask for help. When finals got hard, Grandma sent me postcards with recipes written on the back. When I broke up with my first girlfriend, Grandpa used all his wisdom to say, simply, "Ouch." And then he took me fishing without expecting silence or talk. They got old, not all at once, but then suddenly. It started with my grandfather repeating himself, and then the day he called me by my father's name, which he never used unless he had to. It was summer, the hydrangeas exploding in big, foolish blue balls along the fence. Grandma sat, small and stubborn, with a stack of pills she arranged like a tiny city. She pretended her breathlessness was just humidity, and we pretended we believed her. When Grandpa fell in the upstairs hallway, I found him thanks to the creak in the 3rd stair. He was embarrassed, more than hurt. We made a joke about getting old together even though I was 22. They died the way married people sometimes do, close. Grandma went first in October while the trees were loud with color. She squeezed my hand and said, "You were the easiest part." Like I had done something for her when all she'd done was hand me my life. Grandpa held on until January, stubborn to see the new year. After the funeral, the house felt like a ship with the captain gone. Every floorboard sounded like a memory crossing the room. The will reading was in a law office that smelled like paper and carpet cleaner. I sat in a chair too big for me and tried to keep my hands from shaking. The attorney had glasses that made his eyes look like the friendly fish in a children's book. My parents sat 2 seats away, my mother already crying in her polite, attractive way. My father looked like a man swallowing a cough. There were little bequests to charities, Grandma's church, Grandpa's veterans group, and then there was the house and the savings they'd been building for decades. Approximately $982,000 in liquid assets, the lawyer said, like it was nothing more than a weather report. The trust was for me with specific instructions: education, maintenance of the house, healthcare if I needed it. There was a letter in my grandmother's tidy cursive, telling me that the money was the least of it, that the house was mine not because they wanted to pick sides but because they'd watched me grow under its roof, and it felt right for me to open its windows in spring and close them in October. My parents sat very still. Afterward, in the parking lot, my mother hugged me with her nails pressed too gently into my back, like she could leave a message there. "We're happy for you, baby," she said, and her voice was trembling with something that wasn't quite grief. In the months that followed, I didn't buy a sports car or a boat or anything that showed up on the porch with a bow. I paid the rest of my tuition and graduated. I replaced the roof. I refinished the floors because Grandma always said the house was a kind of living thing and we owed it care. I put most of the money in boring investments like Grandpa taught me, Index funds, slow and steady. I got a job that felt honest. I became a school counselor. There is something holy about sliding a granola bar across a desk to a hungry kid and watching relief loosen their shoulders. The first ask from my parents was small. $50 for a copay. My mother's text came with a picture of her swollen ankle and a lot of crying emojis. I sent it without thinking, and she replied with 3 red hearts and a "you're such a good son." The second ask was $100 for the electric bill. The third was $200 for groceries, which turned out to be a weekend at a lakeside Airbnb because we haven't had a break in forever. I wished them a nice trip and swallowed the bad taste in my mouth. When they asked for a temporary loan for a business opportunity, a friend of my father's was flipping motorcycles. I said I couldn't. My mother's response was immediate and sharp. "You know we would do it for you." I stared at those words for a long time. The asks became expectations. The expectations became demands. They started using phrases like, "your grandparents' money," and "you're so lucky," and "we deserve to share in the blessing." They told relatives I was tight and ungenerous, as if generosity can be extracted like a molar. At Christmas, my mother slipped a catalog across the table to me, open to a stainless steel refrigerator that cost more than the car I drove. "Ours is on the fritz," she said, with a shrug that wasn't a shrug. My dad poured more wine and said, "Your grandparents would want you to take care of family." I excused myself and stood in the bathroom, bracing my hands on the sink, listening for something inside me that wasn't anger. I could hear Grandma's voice like a radio tuned low. "Sometimes love is a garden and sometimes it's a fence." I went back to the table and said, "Careful like stepping through snow on a roof. I have boundaries around the inheritance. It's for the house and for the life they wanted me to build. It's not for other people's purchases." My mother looked at me like I had spoken a dead language. My father laughed once, mean and short, and said, "After everything we did for you." I thought about all the things they hadn't done, and I said, "Maybe this isn't the time." Christmas wrapped itself up in silence. You don't cut off your parents in one dramatic chop. It's more like pruning a vine that's strangling a fence post, snip by careful snip. I offered alternatives. I invited them for dinner and set out paper, pens, and my budget template. "We can go through numbers," I said. "We can call the bank together. I can help you find a credit counselor." My mother rolled her eyes like I'd suggested a chore that only poor people do. My father tapped the table with his index finger and said, "We're not children." I nodded, though the sentence I thought was, "Then stop asking me to parent you." The coup de grace, if you can call a guilt grenade that, was their announcement that they wanted to renew their vows for their 30th anniversary, and it would mean the world if I covered the venue and the catering so they could feel special for once. I asked how much they were thinking. My mother, already jubilant, said the number the way children say roller coaster, 25,000. I said no. She stared at me like I'd pulled the plug on her life support. My father said, "You ungrateful little," and then, catching himself, sat back and crossed his arms, like a man who lost a bid at auction. Their campaign moved public. They posted vague statuses about being abandoned by those they poured their blood, sweat, and tears into. Relatives called me. "You know how your parents are," my Aunt Linda said, her voice trying to be soft and landing in the middle. "But you also know what that house is worth." I said, "It's not about worth." I said it over and over in different rooms, to different people who wanted me to be the better person by being their bank. There were moments I almost caved. The day my dad showed up at the house with a mechanic's estimate for his truck, "So I can get to work," and put it on the kitchen table like a summons. I looked at the number and thought about his hand that used to land heavy on my shoulder when a camera came out. I thought about the time he laughed when I cried because he forgot to pick me up in the rain. My mouth filled with the taste of it. "No," I said. He stared at me like I was a stranger. He took his paper and left without closing the screen door. It banged against the frame for a full minute. Another time my mother texted me a photo of a bill in red letters and added, "If I die because of stress, I hope you know it's on you." I typed and deleted so many replies that my phone got warm in my hand. I ended up sending her the number of the nonprofit counselor I'd found and a message that said, "I won't discuss money outside of a budget conversation with a third party." She sent back a photo of me at 7 with the cupcake. The caption, "Remember who you were before they turned you against us." I sat on the back steps and cried so hard I gave myself a headache. I started therapy. A woman with kind eyes and the wardrobe of a person who spends most of her time sitting in chairs said, "Let's disentangle love and obligation." We drew diagrams. We gave things names. She told me I was allowed to grieve parents who never showed up, allowed to mourn the fantasy of a mother who remembered my birthday because it mattered to her and not because a picture would land well with her sister. Then she asked what I wanted to do with my life that didn't have their shadow in it. The question felt like the first breath after coming up from the deep end of the pool. So I leaned into the life my grandparents sketched for me. I kept my job and got good at it. I learned the names of the janitors and the favorite snacks of the kids who came to my office because nowhere else felt safe. I planted tomatoes like Grandpa, careful and hopeful in equal measure. I hosted small dinners around the oak table, pot roast and mashed potatoes and stories that wandered like cats. I painted the upstairs hallway, and every time I climbed past the third stair and heard it creak, I said, "I know," out loud, like I was answering the house's skepticism. I set aside a portion of the trust's earnings to seed a little scholarship in my grandparents' names. $500 here and there to cover exam fees, field trip costs, choir costumes. The first time I handed one out, the kid cried into her sleeve. I took 2 long breaths and thought maybe this is what money is for. The last time I saw my parents together, they came to the porch after I'd stopped responding to anything that wasn't a request for counseling or to meet a counselor. My mother wore sunglasses even though it was cloudy. My father had a stack of papers, bills, printouts, emails. They didn't ask to come in. My mother started with a story about the old days, how cute I was in Oshkosh overalls. My father started with numbers, straight to the point. Then my mother said, "We made mistakes, but you got lucky." Her voice cracked the way it does when she's about to cry pretty. I said I didn't feel lucky. I said I felt loved by 2 people who taught me to be careful with what you're given. I said I'd needed more from them than the myth of us. Then I said the sentence I'd practiced in my head. "I won't be giving you money. If you want help building a plan, I will sit with you. But I won't finance your life." My father looked at my mother like he wanted permission to explode. She kept her sunglasses on and said, very evenly, "You'll regret this when we're gone." I thought of Grandma and Grandpa and how regret sits with you like a dog that never learns to stay off the couch. I thought I already carry enough of that. After they left, I wrote them a letter. It wasn't fancy, not recorded in a lawyer's office with seals and blue ribbons. It was just me and a ballpoint pen at the oak table, the window open to let in a breeze that smelled like rain. I said I loved them, because it's true and because love isn't a reward. I said I was done discussing money. I gave them, again, the number for the counselor. I said I would be open to rebuilding something small and honest that lived in the present tense and not the scripted past we performed for relatives. I said the door would be open on holidays from 1 to 3, and they could come for coffee and pie, no demands allowed. Mostly they didn't come. Once my mother did, alone, wearing a sweater I recognized from a catalog, trembling a little like she'd skipped lunch. We sat at the table and talked about nothing for a long time. Gardens, the stubbornness of laundry stains, a neighbor's untrimmed hedges, like people who used to know each other. She looked at the pictures on the wall. My diplomas framed next to Grandpa's war photo and Grandma in a polka dot dress holding a pie bigger than her head. She said, "They loved you," and I said, "Yes." And for a second she was just a woman standing in a house that once belonged to someone else. The voicemails still come sometimes. A refrigerator. Car problem. The vow renewal transformed into a weekend in Vegas. Foreclosure. I don't answer. The money sits where it's supposed to, in accounts with names that sound like rivers. It does what it was meant to do. It keeps the roof from leaking, the taxes paid, the lights on in the room where I'm writing this. It helps me buy granola bars and little scholarships and a better, quieter version of my life. When I walk the perimeter of the yard in spring, checking the fence for the places winter tried to pry it apart, I think of Grandma's voice and how fences aren't about keeping love out but about telling it where the gate is. I think of Grandpa's hands, big and sure, fitting the latch into place. Some nights, if I leave the window cracked and the house settles just right, I hear the third stair's familiar creak and it feels, in a way that isn't haunted, like I'm not alone. I tell them what I've done and what I haven't, and sometimes I imagine Grandma laughing at my crooked rows of tomatoes or Grandpa grunting approval at my freshly oiled hinges. I tell them I'm keeping my promises. This life is ordinary in the ways that matter. The paint chips. The roses need deadheading. The kids at school come to my office with tears, with triumphs, with texts from parents who forgot to say I'm proud of you. I keep a drawer of snacks and tissues and pens, and on hard days I keep a second drawer with letters. My grandmother's in tidy cursive telling me to open the windows in April and close them in October. My grandfather's in a shaky block script near the end that says, "Trust yourself, kid." Sometimes I take those letters out and read them like prayers. Not because the words themselves do magic, but because they tune me back to a frequency where love isn't a trick or a tab to be settled. Where it doesn't matter what relatives see at Thanksgiving, or who knows which brand of refrigerator hums in which kitchen. Where a boy who spent his 7th birthday watching the microwave clock can become a man who sets the table for himself and whoever shows up hungry, and knows, bone deep, that you don't pay for love with cash. You pay for it with attention. You pay for it with boundaries. You pay for it by keeping the creaking house standing, making something living grow in the ground, and keeping the porch light on for the versions of yourself that still wander home in the dark.